A woman named Jackie lives in her car in regional New South Wales. She's on the social housing waiting list. When researchers asked her to describe the experience, she said, "It robs you of your pride and your dignity, your peace of mind. It leaves you psychologically exhausted. You feel shame every day." A man named Jeff sits in a wheelchair in Sydney. The house he rents is completely unsuitable. He can barely move through the doorways. He's on the priority waiting list. When asked how he'd describe the wait, he said one word: hopeless. A mother named Basma lives with her 3 children in overcrowded transitional housing attached to a women's shelter in Tasmania. She's been waiting for years. She described the experience simply: "It's trauma. It's made my health go down. My children and I are always angry." These are not characters in a documentary. These are real Australians, interviewed by researchers at the University of Technology, Sydney, describing what it feels like to be on a waiting list for a home. There are 254,571 households on that list right now, and the list is growing faster than the homes. 254,571. That's the number of households waiting for social housing in Australia, according to the 2026 report on government services from the Productivity Commission. Not individuals, households, families, couples, single parents with children, elderly people living alone. Each one of those 254,000 entries represents a door that doesn't exist. Of those, 122,457 are classified as greatest need. These are people who are homeless right now, people in housing so dangerous it threatens their safety. People in situations so dire they were given priority status. And even with priority, they're still waiting. That priority list grew by 12% in a single year. And here's the number that should keep every housing minister in the country awake at night. 640,000 households across Australia are currently unable to access affordable housing of any kind. Not just social housing, any affordable housing. That's the total pool of unmet demand. Mission Australia, one of the country's largest homelessness organisations, put it simply: without decisive action, this number will grow significantly in the years ahead. They're being generous. It's already growing. It's been growing for 30 years. And the government's plan to address it doesn't even come close. So what does it actually mean to be on the list? In New South Wales, the government's own website states that general applicants can expect to wait 10 years or more in most locations. If you need a 3-bedroom property in Sydney, which means you have children, the projected wait time is more than a decade in 23 of the city's 25 letting areas. In Queensland, some people have been on the waiting list for more than 20 years. Nationally, the Productivity Commission data shows that 50% of newly allocated public housing households waited up to 9 months. That sounds reasonable until you realise that's only the people who actually received housing. The hundreds of thousands who are still waiting aren't counted in that statistic. For people with a disability, the average wait for public housing is 652 days, nearly 2 years. For Indigenous housing, it's 722 days. And while you wait, life doesn't pause. Researchers at UTS, the University of Queensland, and UNSW conducted in-depth interviews with 79 people on waiting lists across 3 states. They found something that statistics can't capture: a state the researchers call waithood, a condition where your life enters a permanent suspension. You can't plan, you can't commit to a job in a specific area, you can't enroll your children in a school with confidence, you can't recover from trauma because you're still living inside the conditions that caused it. One interviewee described it as nerve-wracking, depressing, uncertain. She has a child with a disability. She'd been waiting for years. She asked, "Why can't you support me to better my life in order for a child to have a better life and break that cycle, that generational cycle of poverty?" Nobody answered. The reason nobody answered is that the system that was supposed to help these people was deliberately dismantled. After the Second World War, Australia built public housing at industrial scale. Between 1945 and 1970, government construction accounted for 16% of all residential building in the country. The government didn't just subsidise housing, it built housing. Towers, estates, houses, directly delivered by the state to the people who needed them. By 1966, home ownership reached 71.4%, the highest in Australian history. Public housing was the ladder. It took people from poverty to stability, from instability to ownership. It was one of the most successful social programs in the country's history. Then it was taken apart, piece by piece, decade by decade. From the mid-1990s, government builds collapsed to just 3% of total construction. In 1996, the Howard government effectively terminated Australia's routine national public housing construction program, a program that had run continuously for 50 years. The stock wasn't replaced. Public housing as a share of all housing fell from 6% in 1996 to 2.9% by 2020. The number of public housing households actually decreased over the past decade, from 312,000 in 2016 to 285,000 in 2025. While the waiting list grew, the housing stock shrank. The queue got longer and the counter started closing. Some of that stock was transferred to community housing providers. Total social housing, public and community combined, went from 379,000 households in 2008 to 426,000 in 2024. But that growth hasn't kept pace with the growth in the number of households in Australia. It hasn't kept pace with population growth, and it certainly hasn't kept pace with the waiting list. Compare Australia to other countries. The Netherlands has 30% of its housing as social housing. Austria has 24%. Denmark has 20%. The UK, even after decades of sell-offs, has around 17%. Singapore houses over 80% of its population in government-built flats. Australia sits at around 4%, 4%, in one of the richest countries on earth, with a waiting list of 250,000 families, and a government that calls this a plan. The financial architecture of this failure is simple. Total government funding for social housing and specialist homelessness services was $7.7 billion in 2024-25. Of that, the federal government provided $1.9 billion to states and territories through the National Agreement on Social Housing and Homelessness. $1.9 billion for a waiting list of 254,000 households. Meanwhile, tax concessions for property investors, capital gains discount and negative gearing cost the budget over $21 billion in a single year. The Parliamentary Budget Office confirmed that the capital gains discount alone costs $21.8 billion. 59% of that benefit goes to the top 1%. So the government spends $1.9 billion on the people who have no home and gives $12.9 billion in tax breaks to the richest 1% of property investors. The government spends more subsidising wealthy landlords than it does housing homeless families. That's not a policy failure, that's a priority statement. The flagship response to the crisis is the Housing Australia Future Fund, $10 billion in capital, with the investment returns used to fund new social and affordable housing. The target is 30,000 new homes over 5 years. The Housing Industry Association's response was blunt. We're still a long way from 40,000 finished homes. Australia doesn't need more press releases, it needs more homes. 30,000 homes sounds like a lot until you compare it to the need. 254,000 households are waiting. 640,000 can't access affordable housing. The target covers less than 12% of the waitlist and less than 5% of total unmet demand. At the current rate of allocation, around 7,000 new households housed per year across all social housing programs, it would take over 36 years to clear the existing waitlist, assuming nobody new joins the list. But people join every day, and the list grows every month, without exception. The waiting list isn't what most people imagine. It's not filled with people who made bad choices. It's filled with people who had bad luck, followed by a system that offered no safety net. 63% of main tenants in social housing are female. 45% of people seeking homelessness support cite domestic violence as the primary reason. These are women fleeing abusive partners with their children. Women who chose safety over a roof because the system forced them to choose. 2/3 of all social housing tenants are aged 50 or over. These are not young people who haven't found their feet. These are older Australians who spent their working lives in a country that promised them dignity in old age and then priced them out of it. 20% are Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. First Nations people make up 3% of Australia's population, but 20% of those in social housing need, and their homelessness rate is 11 times higher than non-Indigenous Australians. People with disabilities wait an average of 652 days for public housing, nearly 2 years. In housing that may still be unsuitable when they finally get it, stairs they can't climb, doorways too narrow for wheelchairs, bathrooms they can't use. And then there are the children. 14,200 families on the waiting list include children. 31,000 children living without stable housing. These children aren't statistics. They're in schools, sometimes. Missing days because the family moved again. Falling behind because stress at home destroyed their ability to concentrate. Growing up in conditions that research consistently links to worse health outcomes, worse educational outcomes, worse employment outcomes, and a dramatically higher likelihood of being homeless themselves as adults. The waiting list isn't a queue, it's a conveyor belt that feeds generation after generation into the same cycle of poverty. Here's the part the statistics miss entirely. The 254,000 households on the waiting list are only the people who are still waiting. An unknown number gave up. Researchers have documented a phenomenon they call discouraged demand. People who are eligible for social housing, who desperately need it, but who never applied, or who dropped off the list because they concluded it was pointless. In some states, if you fail to reconfirm your eligibility within a certain time frame, your registration is deleted. Not deferred, deleted. You have to start again. And some people don't have the capacity, the literacy, the mental health, the internet access, the stable address to navigate that process. In most jurisdictions, the income limit to qualify for social housing is below the minimum wage. That means if you work full-time at the lowest legal pay rate in Australia, you earn too much to be eligible for social housing in some states. The system was designed for the very poorest and then underfunded to the point where even the very poorest can't access it. Queensland and Western Australia haven't substantially increased their income eligibility limits in over a decade. The threshold hasn't kept pace with inflation, with rent increases, with reality. The system slowly excludes more and more people by standing still while the world gets more expensive around it. Professor Alan Morris from UTS, who led the Waithood research, said, "We know very little about these people. The invisible waiting list, the people who are eligible but gave up, who need housing but never applied, who fell through the bureaucratic cracks, is likely larger than the visible one. The 254,000 is the floor. The ceiling is somewhere nobody has measured." Here's the cruel irony. When people finally do get social housing, their lives transform. The same UTS research that documented the trauma of waiting also tracked what happened when people were finally housed. The researchers conducted follow-up interviews over 14 months, watching the journey from waiting list to tenancy. The results were extraordinary. People reported dramatic improvements in physical and mental health. Employment prospects improved. Engagement with family and community returned. The security and stability of having a permanent home unlocked capabilities that homelessness had destroyed. 98% of people who received tenancy support were able to maintain their housing and avoid returning to homelessness. That's not a modest success rate, that's near total effectiveness. The system works when it exists, when there are homes to give, when the funding is there. Social housing works, prevention works, tenancy support works. Every piece of evidence says the same thing. Mission Australia put it plainly: with a safe, secure home and the right support delivered at the right time, homelessness can be prevented. The evidence isn't ambiguous, it isn't contested, it isn't complicated. Housing people works. Not housing them costs more. In emergency services, in hospital admissions, in policing, in crisis accommodation, in generational poverty that compounds decade after decade. The government knows this. Every housing researcher knows this. Every social worker knows this, and yet the wait list grows and the homes don't. The government's housing accord targets 1.2 million new homes over 5 years. It's the most ambitious housing construction target in Australian history. It will not be met. The National Housing Supply and Affordability Council estimates 938,000 dwellings will actually be completed, a shortfall of 262,000 homes. Before the program is even halfway through, 250,000 homes are already missing. And the homes that are being targeted aren't social housing. Of the Accord's total, the government is targeting support for 55,000 social and affordable homes. State governments have committed to directly funding at least 25,000 more. Combined, that's 80,000 social and affordable homes over the Accord period. 80,000 against a wait list of 254,000. Against unmet demand of 640,000, against a housing deficit that the government's own council says will worsen through at least mid-2029. The construction industry itself can't deliver. Labour shortages, material cost increases, approval processes that average 173 days in Sydney, profit margins on affordable housing projects below 5%. The developers who could build these homes can't make the numbers work. The councils who approve them can't process the applications fast enough. The government that funds them isn't providing enough money. And every year that passes without sufficient building, the existing stock ages, deteriorates, and shrinks. Public housing built in the 1960s and 1970s is reaching the end of its useful life. Some of it needs demolition, not renovation. The stock is being consumed faster than it's being replaced. The plan isn't just insufficient, it's structurally incapable of solving the problem it claims to address. Every housing expert in Australia has said the same things, for years, repeatedly, to governments that listen politely and do nothing. Mission Australia called for a $500 million homelessness prevention transformation fund. Money spent before people lose their homes, not after. Preventing homelessness is cheaper, more effective, and more humane than managing it. They called for Commonwealth rent assistance to be increased by at least 60%, because current payments lag so far behind actual rents that they fail to prevent the rental stress they were designed to prevent. They called for job seeker and other income support payments to be raised to at least $589 per week, enough to cover basic living costs and stay housed. They called for at least 1 in every 10 new homes built to be social or affordable housing, paired with support services. Not just walls and roofs, but the wraparound help that keeps people housed. The OECD recommended Australia replace stamp duties with a broad-based land tax, a structural reform that would discourage speculation and fund housing infrastructure. The Australian Council of Social Service recommended halving the capital gains tax discount over 5 years and ending negative gearing for new investment property purchases. This alone would redirect billions toward housing people instead of enriching investors. Every one of these proposals is evidence-based. Everyone has been modelled, costed and endorsed by experts. Everyone would make a measurable difference. None of them have been implemented because the political math hasn't changed. 2/3 of households own property. They vote. The 250,000 on the wait list, many of them don't. And in a democracy, that arithmetic is destiny. 254,571. That's not a number. That's a population. If everyone on the social housing waiting list lived in the same place, it would be one of the largest cities in Australia. Bigger than Darwin, bigger than Hobart. A city of people with no homes governed by a country that won't build them. And somewhere in that number is Jackie, still living in her car, still feeling shame every day, still waiting for a call that might never come. Somewhere is Jeff, still in his wheelchair, in a house he can barely navigate, still describing his situation with that single word, hopeless. Somewhere is Basma, still in transitional housing with her 3 children, still angry, still traumatised, still waiting. They were promised a system, a safety net, a country that looks after its people. What they got was a list, a number, a queue that moves so slowly it might as well be standing still. Australia has $8.3 trillion in residential land value, the richest dirt on the planet, and it cannot house 250,000 of its own citizens, not because it can't afford to, because it chose not to. Every dollar spent on tax breaks for investors is a dollar not spent on homes for families. Every year without reform is another year the wait list grows. Every promise made and broken is another person who describes the wait in the same words: hopeless, shameful, soul-destroying. This is not a housing crisis. This is a choice. And until the country chooses differently, the list will keep growing. The homes will keep not being built, and the people on the list will keep waiting for a plan that doesn't exist. If you've made it this far, you understand what's happening. Subscribe and hit notifications. This series is exposing the countries that abandoned their own people while the world looked the other way. If you're in Australia, share this with someone who needs to see it. If you're outside Australia, ask yourself, is this happening in your country too? Drop a comment. I read every one. I'll see ya in the next video.